Our first panel today is about the Sunshine Coalition. And for those of you who don't know what the Sunshine Coalition is, you're going to find out real soon. But let me start first by introducing our panelists. And I'm going to start at the far end with James Quintero. James leads the local government team at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. While being there, he first launched the Texas Budget Source, a one-stop shop to get budget information for governmental entities through the state. And James has done a tremendous job in advocating for open government through TPPF, and we sincerely appreciate his efforts. Next to him, we've got Luis Figueroa. Luis is the current Legislative and Policy Director for the Center for Public Policy Priorities. He formerly served as General Counsel for Senator Garcia and Senator Jose Rodriguez's offices. He has a strong civil rights background, was previously at MALDEF, and again, we tremendously appreciate his efforts in advocating for open government. Next to Luis, we've got Linda Pavlik. Linda is currently with the League of Women Voters, but in her prior life was a reporter, a community newspaper owner, has been active with the Society for Professional Journalists, and generally just gets the whole importance of free speech and open government. We're pleased to have her here today. And finally, I've got Terry Burke, who is actually double booked for today. We're very fortunate that she's made time to be here this morning. Terry is the executive director of the ACLU here in Texas. She too previously served as a reporter and an editor for more than 30 years and was formerly on the FOIFT board. So we have a phenomenal panel with us. And the reason that all of these individuals were asked to join us is because they represent groups that have become a part of the Sunshine Coalition. And so what is the Sunshine Coalition? Have to give a little bit of history before we actually get to what it is, but Texas has had some tremendous hits to our Public Information Act through court decisions. And those court decisions, we tried to remedy them last session. We spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get agreed upon legislation to get passed to fix some of the problems that had been caused. And we're not successful because, quite frankly, we just didn't have a deep enough bench. And so what we've done this legislative interim is we have reached out. We've reached out to other organizations that value open government and free speech as much as we do. And as you can see from the makeup of the panel, it's a nonpartisan issue. This is an issue that we've got both sides of the aisle represented here today. And through our coalition, we've actually got about 15 different organizations. Y'all have a little flyer in the back. Here we go. See? Very pretty. It's got a list of all the coalition members. We are expanding that coalition every single day, but these are all organizations that share the same passion for the need for open government. And they all have come together to support the efforts to get legislative reform to our Texas Public Information Act. And we've got 4 different pillars that we stand for. They're on the back of the flyer. And that's what we're going to talk about here today on the panel. If I get the AV working again, I'll show you our website. But that's a little bit of background, and I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists why their organization is interested in government transparency and has decided to join the Sunshine Coalition. So James, why don't you lead off?
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here and taking such an interest in what I think is one of the most important issues in the next legislative session. And I don't say that to be a suck up or to to get good press, but where I see the importance of this issue is in the ability of the taxpayer to know, understand, and control their government bodies. If we look at the first portion of the Public Information Act, its stated purpose is to allow people to the people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. The Public Information Act is a tool that people use in order to have authority and oversight over their officials. And so from the standpoint of a fiscal conservative, I think this is one of those critical tools that we cannot allow the continued deterioration of. And so TPPF is happy and joyful to stand with the Sunshine Coalition in its efforts next session. I think we're going to do a lot of really good work to help people better understand what's happening in their state and local government. So.
All right, let's just go on down the road.
All right.
Luis?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. Obviously, we believe this is an incredibly important issue. And why? Because at CPPP, Center for Public Policy Priorities, we believe in the data that should inform the policies. We strongly value access to information and data, not only to hold our elected officials accountable, which is extremely important, but to inform the policy debates itself. Representative democracies are dependent on accurate data, informed electorates, and functional institutions that serve their constituents. And the transparency of data is critical to that accountable government. So at CPPP, we consider ourselves to be the data experts. We believe in accurate information that needs to be verified and checked, and that means that we need to have access to some of that information. So we believe strongly in strengthening the oversight and transparency of economic development tax incentives to ensure public's accountability of resources. And we are proud to stand with this coalition because we all may come at it from different angles, but the end goal is a transparent government that informs our democracy and makes our democracy stronger. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you. All right, Linda.
Yes, I represent the League of Women Voters. Let me say that we are more than just a league of women. We do have men who have joined us in organizations. So that's a misnomer from when it was established back in the suffrage days. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We do not take positions for, against, vote for, elect so-and-so, defeat so-and-so. We do not do that. Our whole premise is that by informing the public, by informing those who will hopefully vote, they will be able to cast a ballot that is based on knowledge and facts and will be the best for all, and certainly them as they move forward in life. The League, for years, has followed this whole discussion of open government. The last couple of years, I've held the portfolio, quote and unquote, that's League terminology. We get very officious there. The open government portfolio, which means I track the legislation and keep our membership here on a statewide basis informed. We also deal a little bit with on the federal level. Bottom line that, again, voters must be informed. If they cannot learn what is happening where, how government's spending our money, or maybe the accolades that the government is spending our money correctly, then they can go ahead and comfortably vote for an incumbent. So the League is right there in the middle. We're proud to be in the middle, proud to be here with such a diverse group, and look forward to talking with you more.
Thank you. And Terry Burke from the ACLU, we obviously called each other this morning, both compared on the wardrobe. Go ahead.
So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Laura. And I'm sorry I'm not going to be here at lunch, so I'll just say now that so much of the work of this coalition over the last few years, Laura has been right out there in front and helping all of us, and we have a lot to thank her for. So I'm glad that you're going to get thanked at lunch. So I would concur with everything that's already been said about why this is important, but our organization also is nonpartisan, and we're really here on behalf of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we believe that when government is done in secret, then democracy is threatened. And I think today, we have a real opportunity to engage the public on this issue. When I was a journalist, I used to talk to folks about this was Public Information Acts and FOIAs were not just for journalists. they are really designed for the public. And I think that's an educational issue that we need to continue to push. And I think now is a ripe time for that. I think the public is angry at government across the board. That's not a left or right anger, it's general anger, and I think transparency in government is more important than ever to people, and I think when they see, as Linda said, good things government is doing, but it's also essential to know what else they're doing, particularly if they're doing it in secret. So that's why we're part of this coalition and eager to do this work this year. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now, let's go into what each of you perceive to be the biggest threat to open government at this time. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Luis, you want to start?
So from CCCC's perspective, the thing that we're really concerned about is for the past 2 years, stakeholders, media, and everyone but the most powerful elected officials have reported both incredibly slow response times, increased costs, and general unresponsiveness for program and utilization data from state agencies, local governments, really across the board. We recently got a bill for $5,000 for a request for agency data and analysis of Health and Human Services policy change that eliminated the second 6-month segment of continuous Medicaid eligibility for Texas children. So it's becoming apparent that there's been a consolidation, we believe, of power. There's continuous new obstacles and new precedents that are being created, both in the courts, both on the agency level, even from Attorney General opinions, which we'll get into in more details, that are preventing the access to not only taxpayer information, but the data that is necessary to inform the policy debates. And this is a very concerning time when I think we need to have more sunshine, more spotlight, more data on these policies, where we're in an age of where facts are always disputed and there is a continual onslaught of misinformation out there, and it's hard to distinguish what's right and what's wrong. It's important that our government institutions provide the data that they have so we can separate fact from myth. And when that information is obstructed, it promotes inaccuracies across the board. So that's where we're coming from. And like I said, we're going to work very hard next session to open up some of these, to eliminate some of these loopholes. In my previous capacity, Senator Rodriguez was proud to co-sign with Senator Watson's bill, and I know we have a staffer here for Senator Watson's office to address some of these issues. But it is a bipartisan issue, and we think it's something that it's very doable for next session. So thank you again.
I like that. I think it's doable too. And I think it's going to take everyone in this room's help and many, many others. Linda, how about you? What do you see as the...
And I would emphasize that it's more than bipartisan effort. It's a nonpartisan effort. That's a word that we at the League continue to use very out front and consistently. I think, and from our perspective at the League, the problem is more global. It's larger. The problem rests with each and every one of us, our cousins, our next door neighbor, our child's school teacher, in that as cultures change and people are just flooded with whatever information that's out there, there's general fatigue on the part of the population. And we have, as a society, may have actually just lost track of our basic premises. And that's what the League's all about. And I'm hopeful that our media will also help us all to remember that and deal in more fact-driven information.
Terry, what do you see as the biggest threats to open government?
You know, I think for a long time we've seen this growing privatization of government, and that is very troubling. I mean, among the 4 pillars of the Sunshine Coalition, we address this issue because it is so important. There are so many ways for government to skirt open information for the public when they're using private entities to do the work. I think that is scary. When we can't know what are the anticipated outcomes that these private contracts lay out. So we don't know if we don't know if the government's doing good work or bad work. So I think that's a huge threat. But I think there's also this movement of having more things done under regulatory umbrellas, which is also, I mean, there's so many regulatory agencies that I don't know how you keep up. In fact, we operate in a lot of coalitions, and it's always amazing to go to those coalition meetings and hear from groups, something they've picked up from a regulatory agency. We need to keep lawmaking done in lawmaking bodies, and I think we need to put some brakes on the privatization.
Makes sense. How about you, James?
So the biggest threat I see is that there are new and bigger barriers emerging to prevent access to information. So when I first joined the foundation in March 2008, one of the reasons I was actually brought on board was because the foundation launched something called Texas Budget Source, which brings back a lot of memories, a lot of bad memories. And the goal of the project was to collect and make public every local government's budget, financial statement, check register, and put it all in one place, right? So that meant sending out thousands upon thousands of Public Information Act requests basically every day, every month, right? We would collect all of this information, put it online. Some of the, well, I had a lot of lessons learned through that project, but some of the things that happened, of course, were elevated cost estimates would come in just to provide a simple PDF budget. Sometimes my emails would get lost in the ether, right? And they'd say we never got it. Other delay type things. That was the stuff we were dealing with back in 2008. Today, we have bigger challenges, I think. And I point to some of the stuff that's happening with Amazon right now. So as many of you know, a lot of cities used third-party entities to submit bids to Amazon. That's not a new practice, but I see it becoming more and more prevalent. And when you go to a city like Austin and say, okay, well, let me see what we are potentially proposing to this very large employer in terms of tax incentives and land grants and all the rest, they say, well, we can't give you that information because we didn't officially make the bid. So it's things like that. It's those barriers that I hope this coalition can help overcome in the next session. Because as Luis said, making sure that we have an informed electorate who is knowledgeable about the decisions as well as the spending is absolutely crucial.
And that brings us into the 4 pillars of the Sunshine Coalition. There's basically 4 things that this group of varied organizations all agree upon that need to be fixed. I put up on the screen the Sunshine Coalition website. So in addition to reaching out to a number of different organizations and bringing them together to discuss issues and to find some common ground for how we can approach these problems, we've also started a campaign, an awareness campaign for the general public. And we've got the website, which is at txsunshine.org. We've got social media handles that are, again, on your handout, Twitter handle at txsunshine19, and we've got a Facebook page. But what the website does and what the other social media platforms do is it informs the public about the growing need for reform and the significance of the problem. And so what you see here is under the tab, Keeping Texans in the Dark. We see that basically 3 primary issues, 2 of them are enveloped in the secrecy about taxpayer dollars. Secrecy about taxpayer dollars has been impacted significantly by 2 Texas Supreme Court decisions from 2015. One involved Boeing, and the other involved the Greater Houston Partnership. And the panelists will be able to speak more on these issues, but in a nutshell, what Boeing did was it enabled private entities to be able to foreclose the ability for taxpayers to get information about contracts that they have with the government if they felt like it would put them at a competitive disadvantage in the future. What GHP did was almost the same thing with regard to contracts with nonprofit organizations. So if the government organization contracts with a nonprofit and the nonprofit is performing traditional government functions, that nonprofit, unless they are sustained by the taxpayer dollars, can prevent taxpayers from getting the information about how that money's being spent. So Terry mentioned this, the increasing privatization of government work, and the fact that these two opinions now make it more difficult for taxpayers to be able to do what James mentioned, which is find out how much money is being spent. Find out whether or not those accountability markers are being met. If we're providing incentives and those organizations are supposed to provide X number of jobs, or they're supposed to do certain safety measures or certain things in the community, we have no way of being able to tell whether or not they are meeting the markers that they have indicated that they will meet when they originally contracted. So this is a huge issue. It's all the ability to access information about taxpayer dollars. The second issue, or third issue really, is the secrecy about dates of birth. Again, because of a 2015 decision, this one involving the city of Dallas versus Paxton, now all dates of birth in all public records are cut off. That has a tremendous impact on the ability to verify that you're talking about the right person. It has a tremendous impact on the ability to do background checks, to get same-day lending, to do a whole bunch of things when it comes to the economic engines of the state of Texas that are reliant on public information. The last pillar is the secrecy about government work on private devices, and this is something that y'all are familiar with. Obviously, everyone carries a phone. Sometimes those phones are issued by the government, sometimes they're not. If you're a government employee and you're conducting public business on your private device, the AG has said for a long time, and we codified, the legislature codified in 2013, the fact that it is the information, not the device, that controls whether or not the information is subject to the TPIA. So you look to the content, not the device. Unfortunately, because phones are not necessarily issued by the government is not the custodian of that phone. And so oftentimes the public information officer has said, look, I understand that you believe that there's public information on this private device, but I can't reach it. I'm not the custodian of that device. And so the last pillar is to close off that loophole, to make it so that there's actually a mechanism to get the information if it's held on a private device and it's subject to the TPIA. So those are the four pillars in a nutshell. But I'd like for our panelists to talk about why these are significant and perhaps to give some examples of areas in which they've run into problems involving the four pillars. So Terry, do you want to start us off?
I mentioned the privatization issue. I mean, we have been particularly concerned about this with regard to private prisons. The federal government has a lot of prisons that are run by private operators, as does the state of Texas. And these contracts are such that we can't learn anything. I mean, I'll give you one example. Where you do learn it is when you get into litigation. We sued the T-Don Hutto Detention Center in Taylor a few years ago over sexual assaults of women who were asylees who were being released and driven to the airport. And there was a guard in driving those vans who was stopping the van en route to the airport and sexually assaulting the women. When we got into the litigation and were able to see some parts of the contract, it was in the contract that there had to be a person in the van, a guard in the van of the same gender as the people in the van. But they were violating that for cost reasons, mainly. If you have one driver and you don't have to have a second person in the van, then you're saving money. But we didn't learn that until we were in litigation, until these women had already suffered. Another one is the state of Texas releases data on their public prisons, the publicly operated prisons, about if there have been escapes and what kinds of crimes the inmates have committed when they escape. Private prison operators would have to litigate it to get the contracts. So the point is, we don't know what's being required, what are the terms of the deals, so we don't know what the value is of the work of these folks. And I was talking to someone on our staff about this issue, and they pointed out we are members of the Greater Houston Partnership. I am on one of the major committees of the partnership. But obviously, this is an area and we're a nonprofit, but obviously this is an area about which we disagree, and that happens for all of us, I'm sure. But the private prison is the thing that is most important to us recently, where we have seen this over and over. And so we'd really like to see a way to open up these contracts to public information.
And James, I see you've got some thoughts on this.
Oh, one or two. I'm still a little amused / disheartened by one of the cases that I think initiated a lot of the legislative action in the prior session. One of the things that happened in the city of McAllen was that the city went and procured the services of Enrique Iglesias. And I'm an Enrique Iglesias fan. But I don't think that the city should withhold certain documentation related to what it paid Enrique and for what services he was paid for. They ended up shooting down the McAllen Monitor's request for a lot of this information. And in fact, the issue ultimately, I believe, went to the Attorney General's office, where the city said that releasing this information would undermine similar efforts to procure professional entertainment and artists for next year's annual holiday parade. And so this wasn't a one-off, right? This is something that they expect the continuation of. And so I don't believe situations like this should be accepted from disclosure. This is clearly in the public's interest to know what's going on here. And then there's lots of other examples like this, but it's stuff like this that I hope the coalition can really shine a light on and get down into the details of, because people have a right to know.
And so I was just clicking on the tab on the website. So we actually have a bunch of examples on the website of information that has now been closed off that used to be open to the public. And that includes final contracts. And so now we're in a situation where you can have a final contract like the city of Denton had for $256 million, the single highest expenditure in that city's history, and the inability of Denton residents to see the terms of the contract. They can't see if the terms are being met or if they're not being met because of this Boeing decision. Texas is the only state in the nation that allows private businesses to dictate whether or not taxpayers can get the information about contracts that they enter into with the government. We have gone from being one of the best. We used to be a model for public information nationwide to one of the worst. And it's happened in the last 3 years through primarily these court decisions and through the lack of legislative reform. So something clearly needs to be done. Luis, What are your thoughts on the 4 pillars?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, coming at it from different angles, my previous job, working for Senator Jose Rodriguez El Paso, there were a number of information that was trying to be hidden in text messages from city council members that was related to the ballpark development there in El Paso. It was through the open records request that we learned that the school district was having huge conflicts of interest in some of their bid processing. So a lot of this comes out in different ways. To me, the Boeing decision really jumped out at me as researching it because of just the dramatic expansion of the exemption that was previously held by the government entity. It's so broadly broadened the definition of competitive advantage as well. If you read the facts on the case, Boeing did not identify any particular federal contract which it was currently or would soon be competing in. It was merely that it could potentially be at some point in some other contract, it could potentially be a competitive advantage. And the court record found that there was only one company in the entire world that could be a competitor in this situation in Europe, and that there was no ongoing competitive bid processing anywhere in the world or the United States where it was currently being bid on or in competition. So it was such a broad definition of competitive advantage, and then the fact that the right is held by the private entity, the third party, rather than the government entity, really struck me as a broad expansion. The other one, some of the examples on the website I thought were particularly compelling. The city of Houston receiving requests regarding battery issues with the police body cams. This was a huge issue last session with police body cams and the importance of it, and withholding the information regarding that request on the rollout of police body cams. The public's in it, and it's really across the board. Public school charter schools were able to withhold copies of proposals, bid tabulations, and scoring sheets concerning T-Mobile. Again, huge issue across the state, and determining policies between the competitive advantage between charters and public schools. Whatever you are in that position, we should at least have access to the information. So I think I highly recommend people to visit the website, because there's such a plethora of examples out there that no matter what issue you care about, you'll see the ramifications of it and the importance of why we need to see this information and not hide it.
Linda, you had something to say?
I will say that it's not all about big business, too. As a small business, I've transitioned from news organizations to having my own public relations, public affairs firm with a focus on working with the media. But as a small business, if I have proposed with TxDOT or an ISD to do a communication strategies, I do not get the contract. I request a copy of the contract and/or the proposal from the winner. I cannot get it. And this is not something that just happened in the last year or two. It's been happening now over the last 10 years. I'm small, I'm insignificant. That total contract amount may have been $24,900 or something over a period of a year, but I still cannot access that information, even if I agree to redact, or for them to redact the financial information that may have been put in by the proposer or something like that, their own financial status. So I think it's, yes, we woke up because of this huge Boeing and who Boeing is, but all of us every day are being impacted in that way. The league, we are focused, well, I'll also say that since for the last 10 to 15 years, the League of Women Voters have taken a position early on against privatization, and we continue to refine our policy statements to ask for, demand more information from those private contractors. So that's a league position. The date of birth issue for us, it can be huge because of voter fraud. And keeping in mind that we are the League of Women Voters of Voters, and we are extraordinarily concerned about this surge of voter fraud that's now becoming public. I don't know who out here in our audience hasn't shown their driver's license in the last 24 to 36 hours for some purpose. And we just don't even blink, do we? I mean, it's kind of like, I need to see this when I check into the hotel. If I go to the bank to get cash, I've got to show my driver's license, et cetera, and so forth. So to us, while it seems so minor, we really must have that. We need to be able to tell the difference, the media, we need to be able to tell the difference on who George Smith really is so that we are accurate in our reporting. We also, from that standpoint, it's gotten so bad that our governments are not necessarily even required to make public the age of a candidate for public office. That is sobering, is it not? And the candidate should be demanding that that be part of the public information that's shared. Thank you.
Yeah, the date of birth issue is an interesting one. It's one, I can tell you that we've had litigation that has involved people with very common names, and not being able to determine, because we no longer have access to the date of birth, whether the John Smith that was actually included in this arrest warrant is the John Smith whose picture you put up, because you may or may not have gotten the correct information from the police department, has really wreaked havoc on the ability to verify and confirm correct information. And I find it interesting because sometimes there's a visceral reaction to this, and yet, like you said, Linda, we show our IDs every day, all day. We put up on social media our birthday. How many of you get like tons of emails from people through Facebook, happy birthday, because you just put it out there voluntarily. You put it on your LinkedIn page voluntarily. It's almost ubiquitous. But it is necessary. It's necessary from an economic standpoint. It's necessary from a verification standpoint, from a criminal justice standpoint. James, do you have any issues that y'all have encountered in this regard?
On the date of birth issue specifically, no, not to my knowledge.
Not yet.
But not yet. But I did want to put a plug in for our litigation team, because as y'all may know, a few months ago, we launched a lawsuit against the city of Georgetown for withholding some very basic financial information. What ended up happening is an area resident wanted to know wanted some financial information from the city of Georgetown relating to the installation of some solar panels. Specifically, he wanted a payback analysis. The city fought the release of that information and said that it wasn't going to disclose that particular detail because it related to a competitive matter. And it ultimately went to the Texas Attorney General's office, who sided with the city. This area resident said, okay, fine. If you're not going to give me the payback analysis, give me the documentation substantiating your claims that it's related to a competitive matter. The city then responded, well, none of that information exists. And it was at that point that our litigation team stepped in and said, okay, well, let's take this to court, because clearly there's something funny going on here, and we need to shine a light on what exactly is happening in Georgetown. And so we are trying to put our money where our mouth is, both in terms of policy and outreach, as well as litigation. Again, this is such an important area for us. We're going full throttle because I think people need to be informed.
Thank you for doing that, Linda.
Let me quickly say, also, I believe I read on our website that there's been 10,000 AG rulings since that 2015 ruling, which has essentially said no, that information is not public. That is absolutely huge. Then we also should be aware of the games that our local governments will play strategically on when they release information, at what time and when there will be any sort of vote, public vote on a contract and or a budget. And I truly believe, and I think it's coffee shop talk, but I believe it. I'm still a reporter, so I'm always listening. But that the city will look at a date and time. So if they get a request for information, 10 days, appeal to the AG. This happened in my city, Fort Worth, a couple of years ago with the budget. the public could not get a full draft budget document because of the games that the city played. And that, I mean, to go ahead and try to litigate that, it doesn't make any sense. We just got to make sure we change things. Thanks for that.
Now, oftentimes, the delay prevents the information from coming out in a timely manner, and then it's a moot point.
Exactly.
And so that's the problem. Now, both of you mentioned the AG, though, and I want to talk about the AG process. I mean, that is something where Texas is also somewhat unique, and it's something where we really do have the advantage of having the AG rule on these things in advance of having to go to litigation. The problem is with the breadth of these court decisions, the AG's office's hands are really tied. They don't do any fact-finding. This is not a litigation process. It's not something where discovery is taken. It's something where they just assume the representations that are presented to them are true. So in James's example, where the private contractor has said it's going to put me at a competitive disadvantage, the AG's office believes that to be true in making its ruling and has to then rule within the confines of the court decision. So they don't do what TPPF did and say, give me the backup for how this has put you at a competitive disadvantage. That takes going to litigation. And I don't know about y'all, but there are very few people out there that have the discretionary funds to go to litigation over all of these issues. And so as Linda brought up, the significance of this problem is vast in terms of the AG's workload and in terms of the tremendous amount of information that is being cut off. The Boeing ruling in and of itself has been cited in 2,600 rulings since 2015, closing off access to information that used to be open to the public, including final contracts. The date of birth decision, 10,000 rulings. 10,000 rulings in 3 years. So we're talking about just an enormous, enormous volume of information that is no longer available. Now, Luis mentioned, he mentioned the issue of conducting business on private devices, and that's something that, again, on our website, you'll see some examples of this under the secrecy tab, secrecy about government work on private devices. But Luis, you've worked on the inside, so I'd like to hear how does it work from that standpoint?
Right. So the big secret, which I don't think anybody thinks is a secret, is that I do not know one single elected official that uses their state email. They all use a private email system to conduct most of their business. And so when you receive an open records request, and I have to say, as a general counsel, your job is to protect your elected official from any legal liabilities, as well as some political liabilities. So I have a certain amount of understanding of trying to avoid the gotcha politics of you're requesting something to try to find any. Sometimes we'll get requests of like, what conversations have you had regarding with this one person in order to try to find that nugget of a quote so that they can try to get you in a political campaign. So I get where some of the elected officials come from, but it was our practice that whenever we got an open records request, and the way it goes is normally it goes to all the elected officials, and the Secretary of the Senate, Patsy Spa, who we all respect and love, will filter out the request and let us know what we need to do, and let us know, what we have to supply or not supply under the exemptions. But our practice, and we were very clear about it, is we had to go through all of the private emails and search it for the terms or for whatever they was looking for. And it was part of our practice, and it was very clear that we had to do that. But I'm not sure all the offices are doing that, and I'm not sure that it's common practice and well known. I think there's a lot of officials out there that think, oh well, if it's on my private account, then I'm free, and nothing has to be searched through that. Or cell phones, we know, like I mentioned, El Paso, a lot of the elected officials there were not realizing that their cell phones were subject to the open records request. So it is important to educate the existing law to elected officials and to all government entities that you cannot hide behind the custodian, that you're not the custodian of it, that you still need to do the affirmative effort to search through your private email accounts for any state business related to that open registry request. And it is not that onerous. We were able to do it relatively quickly. An email would go out to all staff and say, make sure to search your state email and your private emails for any work examples related to this issue. And it is very doable. So I just wanted to say that I think we need to do a lot of education on this issue, but it is doable, and even as a general counsel whose goal was, or whose job it was to protect the legal liabilities of a senator or an elected official, it is still very much within your obligations to make sure they comply with the law.
Terry?
We wish everybody were Luis Figueroa. And why did you leave? No. If you look at the website and the examples under this header on the website, all but one required extensive litigation for the taxpayer or whomever to get the information they wanted that had been on a private device. The one that didn't involve litigation was the Victoria Advocate, that reporters were resourceful enough to get what they needed some other way. But the fact is, years of litigation, as Laura said, cost a lot of money. And what's happened is this SB 1368 that was passed in 2013 that codified all these AG opinions, said it's the content, not the device, has effectively been negated by this ability for public entities to say, gee, we didn't have custody of that information, we don't have any way to access it, golly gee, sorry, we can't show you that. Not our fault. That has to be fixed, or 1368 doesn't have much meaning and certainly is lacking some teeth. Some other states, Utah and Washington for sure, I've checked with my counterparts there, they have something they call government records management guidance or acts or something like that, where effectively it says if you think anything on a personal device might have some relevance, whether it's litigation, whether it's legislative intent, then you are obligated to retain that. And that is, and you are obligated to make it available to whomever wants to see it. And so perhaps that's one way for us to address this, but this has to be addressed in this session because I think, as Luis says, I don't send an email to a legislator at his or her house.tx.gov email address. They don't give you those addresses, in fact. So, and I think that's probably even truer in smaller communities, in small cities, small counties, et cetera. I think this is a really serious problem.
And just some backstory on SB 1368. So that was a bill that we spent a ton of time negotiating with governmental entity lobbyists, had agreed upon language, and honestly, it was not going to get passed, even though we had this agreed upon language. That ended up being a Hail Mary that was done on the last days of session. We added 1368 to a Carol Alvarado, Wendy Davis bill, and it came out, and I think it came out and surprised everyone. So we were real pleased when that got passed, and now less pleased to see how people are working around it. Now, some cities have gone and addressed this problem through, like the city of Austin, they have a policy. Their policy is that you need to forward any information from your private device, if you're conducting public business on it, to the city's server. But that's just a policy. It's not a law. It doesn't have any sort of ramification if you don't follow the policy. So that's why there is still a need for legislation on this issue, to be able to give the public information officer the ability to access this information and to be able to produce this information. So let's talk about constitutional issues. Terry, you mentioned that at the very beginning, and the fact that there are constitutional concerns here.
Well, I mean, I think that the public has a presumptive access to the information that helps them understand the workings of their government. As I said earlier, I mean, I think the greatest threat to democracy is government done in secret, and even our threat, it's a threat even to our privacy. I mean, we were talking about the date of birth issue earlier. Everything that we have seen over the last whatever period of time you want to pick, depending, I guess, on how long you've been watching it, it seems that we are just getting the encroachment on our right to know what our government is doing has just, that has just gone deeper and deeper under the cloak of all kinds of issues, particularly privacy is what you hear a lot about. And so when we do it under the cloak of privacy, we close off information. And that's our Constitution. The award today is the James Madison Award. The framers did not envision this. Admittedly, they probably didn't envision Twitter either, but however you define it, whether it was, you know, with quill and ink, or whether it's the computer and databases and all of that, it still is about information. And we can't have a healthy society, a healthy democracy, a healthy government without people being fully informed. We've talked a lot about the informed electorate. Again, I think the framers envisioned that the electorate would know what was going on in their government. And we're being more and more restricted. And we are, and people, I think what's really sort of surprising is how often people sort of give up. You know, there are those flamethrowers and activists who don't, but an awful lot of folks have just sort of surrendered to this in the past, though I think that's, as I said at the start, I think that's changing.
Adding on to that, I think that, yes, we realize litigation is costly. Who among us could afford, have that discretionary dollar that she's mentioned earlier to litigate? Is it worth the 2 to 5 years that it takes to maybe find that for whatever purpose you've been ruled against and you have to pay attorney fees? So this is the league's voice. What can we do individually starting now? What can we do? What can we encourage our friends, our family, our businesses to do? And there's several things. We have elections coming up. Of course, we've got the general election. We've got the spring elections at the local level with the school boards and the city councils. We should be asking every candidate what his or her position is on open government, public records, et cetera. We need to help frame that up. When somebody says, yes, I believe in it, then embrace them. I don't know that I'm suggesting that you publicly endorse them, but say you're right on and encourage them from the backside to keep talking about it. So how those changes are made, I'm not sure, but we can and should assume a responsibility to talking to any and every elected official, especially here at the state level because of legislative matters, but also at the local government, so that all those records can be made public. Then secondly, in preparation for this panel, I looked at the state comptroller's office and their STARS program, and that's also on our website. And what's important and what just shocked me after looking at the cities and the school districts who met the challenge and made public their financial information, okay, that the major cities are not there. You don't see Dallas. You don't see Houston. You don't see the city of San Antonio, but I saw a whole lot of little tiny small towns. In fact, last night I sent a text to a council member of a little burg of 8,000, and I said, congratulations, the city is on this website. So from a standpoint of looking to that, I think, once again, we need to make that fact known, that all these major, big bucks government entities are not even rising to the challenge which is there for them to, on their own terms, voluntarily put their information forward.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Transparency Star program, and I know James is very familiar with it, so I'm going to have him talk about it. I'll just give you a brief overview of it, and you'll hear more about this from Comptroller Hager at the lunch. But it's a voluntary program for governmental organizations to basically put out their financial information. They believe that it is good government to inform residents about how money is being spent. And so they have 5 different stars that the municipality or the city or the local school board or whomever can reach by putting information out there and available on the internet so that anybody can see it. And we've got a handout in the back, looks like this, that basically tells you a little bit about it. But James, I know you worked with the comptroller on this.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of these, a lot of what's materialized now, I give a lot of credit to former Controller Susan Combs, who, beginning with where the money goes, I think really established an excellent footprint when it comes to state and local government transparency. Of course, that effort morphed into a lot of other different programs. And the most current iteration, I think, is a good way to incentivize open government at the local level. So if local officials want to meet certain criteria, then they're recognized in a very public fashion. And I think that actually carries a lot of weight with local officials who are interested in that area, right? It's good to be able to tell your constituents that, we encourage openness and financial transparency when it comes to budgets, check registers, financial statements, et cetera. One of the areas where I'm hoping to really push the envelope next session, especially when it comes to reestablishing the presumption of open government, is we have a big fight on the horizon when it comes to Chapter 312. Chapter 312 is a bill that the legislature is going to have to pass to reauthorize the ability of cities and counties to engage in economic development negotiations, to allow for things like property tax abatements, land grants, and whatnot. The foundation doesn't necessarily support that legislation. In fact, I think we'll be arguing against it. But in the event that the legislature sees fit to pass that bill, I think there's an opportunity for open government advocates to make some headway when it comes to shining a light on the things that happen. So right now, if a local government wants to enter into contract negotiations with a private business, a lot of that stuff occurs behind closed doors. I believe it's 552.131 of the government code effectively allows for that process to occur behind closed doors. That's something that I would love to see repealed and that process brought into the light, so that when when cities and counties enter into property tax abatements, the public has a better understanding of how their tax dollars are potentially being allocated. In addition to that, I would also like to see the legislature require local governments to put all of their existing tax abatement agreements online. There's no reason that this information shouldn't be readily available to the public and accessible. People should have a really good understanding of what's happening in that realm, especially with the property tax situation given the way it is. And then finally, we'll also be asking for a little bit lengthier public debate period. So generally when an agreement is reached between a governmental entity and a private business on an economic development negotiation, the period between when the body will come forward and say, this is what we're going to do, we're going to have a vote on it in short order, that period of time should be lengthened, right? The public should have a longer opportunity to understand the details of the agreement and have a little bit more say in the process. And so I believe the recommendation we're putting forward is 30 days plus from the time that it's made public to the time that it's adopted. So let's give the public more opportunity to weigh in on how their tax dollars are being allocated. So I think we have a lot of really good ideas on how to potentially go at this Chapter 312 fight in the next session that could do a lot to shine a light on some of the secrecy that's occurring now.
I want to interrupt, isn't it right now, basically, bottom line, 72 hours?
Yes.
Before
that's my-
a city council acts, there's the 72-hour notice where the agenda is published, and that's the time one has to read the agenda, learn about what's there, and oftentimes, not the complete council briefing packet is not published either. So that's to be mindful of 72 hours. That is, I mean, so council meets on Monday, and those hours count through the weekend. It's very difficult.
Absolutely. Luis, you look pensive. Do you have any comments on this?
No, I mean, I was actually thinking about, so the person in our office who's going to be working on this is Dick Levine, our most senior member of CPPP. And so I was thinking about all the conversations he's had and how excited he is that he thinks there's a real opportunity next session to really open this up. And he's been working with a group of people. So yeah, I'm excited that we're on the same page on this one. So I think there's a real opportunity next session. And if you want to know more about it, definitely reach out to Dick, and it'll be one of our priorities for next session.
And by the way, Dick and I actually got together in 2015 to push a lot of these same ideas. The Chapter 312 fight wasn't on the horizon, so I don't know that there was the same appetite or opportunity, but we're I think going to partner again and really push the envelope on this.
That's great. Now, Linda mentioned a little bit about how y'all can get involved. I'd like to ask the other panelists what you think are the best ways for folks in this audience and beyond to get involved in this fight. Terry?
Well, come to the Capitol and encourage, again, and I'll defer to somebody like Luis, who's been on the other side of this, but I think we all know that legislators want to hear from their constituents. They don't necessarily want to hear from us. And they want to know that the people who are voting in their districts and their communities care about an issue. And I think you as journalists, you as in other roles, in government roles and so forth, lawyers, you can encourage the people you know, the people you interact with, to get involved in this fight, because the STARS program is terrific. As an old editor, reporter, I love follow the money things. But as we've talked about here today, this is about taxpayer dollars. It is about who's running for office, who are these people who put themselves up as candidates, and if you don't have their dates of birth, it's a little hard sometimes to dig deep into their backgrounds and who they are. We famously in Texas have people who have really famous names that run for office, and they're not really Daniel Boone. I think this is also, we've also talked about the privatization of government. If we don't know what's in those contracts, we don't know about conflicts of interest that our elected officials may have. We don't know, we talked about the devices. We don't know when the school board had a walking meeting when they were all texting with each other about the superintendent's performance. It's all of those things. And we've got to use the tools we each have to encourage the Joes and Janes out there to step forward, speak up, and tell their lawmakers that secrecy just isn't democratic, lowercase d.
Linda mentioned small businesses, and you talked about the importance of hearing, having lawmakers hear from their constituents. If you own a small business and you have a story about something that you were unable to get information about, a bid that you didn't get to didn't get and then couldn't even figure out why you didn't get it because of these recent rulings. That's the perfect kind of story to talk to them about. I mean, America is built on small business. And if small businesses are being shut out because they can't get the information to competitively bid, lawmakers need to know about it. And they love to hear from their constituents. They love to hear why this matters. And, that's just one of many perfect examples. Luis?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about Terry's comments, and I think this is one of those issues where legislators are not going to want to speak out against this, right? Nobody goes out in a campaign and says, "I want to hide the information from the public," right? This is not a winning argument for them. So the way these legislative ideas or proposals are going to die is they're going to die quietly ironically, with no sunshine put on them, right? They're going to, where a bill is quietly killed without any type of public debate. And so it's going to be, and I think so that gets really back to what Terry is saying, when there's public pressure on these types of bills, ethics reform, sunshine bills, it makes it harder to quietly kill the bill because they know that there's a public demand for it. So I think more than any other or maybe not than any other issue, but more than the average issue, this is one where public pressure really helps, and where a news story of a bill that's moving through the process and it seems to be getting stuck for a few weeks, and you start putting pressure on them, could really make a huge difference on this, because like I said, this is an issue that everybody is going to want to publicly support, even if they maybe have some reservations behind the scenes. So the more pressure we can put, I think the more powerful this will be. And of course, the fact that it's such a broad community of advocates, I think is also a very powerful message to the legislature. So kudos to the foundation, for the coalition, for pushing this, and thank you for letting us be part of it.
So just to follow up on the whole, this dies quietly. That's exactly what happened last session. We had a chairman of the House GTO committee who wouldn't allow these bills up for a vote. Never debated on the floor. No public involvement in the process. That's how things die. They do die quietly. James, how can the public get involved?
Good question. So I would say this audience is well placed to help identify as well as help highlight examples, right? It's always helpful to put a face on the policy, because we can talk till we're blue in the face about section 552.001, the implications of that and why it's important. But when you can help us tell a story about how a person is being intimately affected in a negative fashion or positive fashion by their government and the PIA, I think that really helps to communicate to legislators who are already busy and thinking about other things, and really nailing down that, oh my goodness, this is clearly a problem, and if it's happening here, then it's probably happening at other places too. So to the extent that you guys can help us tell stories, I think that is really powerful. That emotional element can't be overemphasized.
And telling those stories, please feel free to send them our way so that we can add examples to the website. That really is meaningful. People need to understand the breadth of the problem, and lawmakers need to understand the impact on their constituents. So please let us know about those examples as well. Linda, I'll let you have the last word.
Dittoing everything that's been said. Now let's talk about timing. I think you've pointed out that things go into a committee, and oftentimes they just never get even discussed in committee. They're left in committee, and that's how they're hidden. So the conversation begins immediately. Even the early filing of bills will start as middle November. The November 15th, my colleague just mentioned that. So now is the time to be tracking that, telling those stories, and getting that support, because we can't go anywhere unless we get that proposed legislation out of that committee in a timely way. And then talk to the governor's office too, because we don't need him vetoing things. Had to add that.
Good point. All right, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience for just a few moments. Okay, so the question was, we are up against some well-funded opposition, which is true, including organizations that are trade organizations for governmental entities, the TMLs, the TASBs, and others. And how do we overcome those sort of both well-funded and well-connected organizations? Thoughts on that? Hang on, let me just start off.
Yeah.
I can tell you that last session, what we did was we sat in a room with all these folks, and we conversed about and tried to work through our differences. And we did have what we believe to be agreed upon legislation with them. It was not them so much as private business
That's what I was going to say.
that is also well-funded, that really, well, they're well-funded, and they are all on the list of financial contributors to that same GTO chairman who blocked everything. I'm just saying. So that was our biggest problem last session, but it's not to say that the organizations that Joe's mentioned or organizations like that have not consistently been our opponents. So the question's still valid.
No, absolutely. I mean, I was just going to say, I think TML and TASB are going to have a lot bigger fights next session. They're, feeling it from a lot of different angles. But in my experience is with TML and TASB and a lot of the Association of Counties, is, as you mentioned, if you can get them in a room and talk to them, they can be really quite reasonable on some of this stuff. So I'm a little less concerned about that as I am from some of the corporate interests that are pretty, quite frankly, very influential at the legislature. And when we talk about bills dying quietly, that's their modus operandi, that, they're really good at doing that. So I think that's a bigger issue, but I think what we said before is elected officials, like I said, don't campaign on anti-transparency platforms. Nobody wants to go into a campaign saying that they were trying to hide the ball on where the money is spent. And so so I think a well-timed, story, press, examples, maybe even, press conference, whatever the tactic may be, can be very powerful on an issue like this where nobody wants to publicly be opposed to it. So I think that's how you get around it, but it's also just staying vigilant and just keeping the pressure on.
My colleague and I here had just, she used the term, let's follow the money, as she did when she's a news reporter. So I think it's incumbent on us to constantly research and understand who's out there, who's on the other side, whose philosophy is completely different from ours. If I were to be going to talk to any sort of legislator and or council member and or school board member about a tedious public policy issue, I will have looked at maybe 3 to 5 years of their campaign contribution expense reports. I'm going to have that snapshot picture so I can start telling my story in a way not to be combative and say, why did you take this person's money or that person's money, but to understand their personalities and what they may have been told, so I have a proactive response to those discussions.
I don't have a great answer either to this, but I notice when, for example, we're working on smart justice reforms, and I notice when I go speak to a legislator about those, he or she will often say, well, what does my district attorney think? What does my sheriff think? So while TML and TASB are powerful associations, I think it's also good to look for players like the mayor of a big city in the legislator's district who might be sympathetic to our point of view, or the superintendent of schools or board president. It gives, because you're giving the legislators something to hide behind. Be able to say, well, you know, the mayor asked me to carry this, or the county judge asked, or something like that. If you can build a sort of critical mass of that, I think that can be helpful. It's not an answer, but it's one step.
So TML and some of the business interests that exist are going to be formidable opposition. There's no doubt about that. But I think one of the ways that we at least challenge some of that in a very robust fashion is emphasize and overemphasize the diversity of different groups that have come together. And so, you know, Luis mentioned like a press conference. I think we gather everybody in the room together who's in support of this and show in a visual way that this is a left-right coalition of significant size. You know, we gather together as many lawmakers who will come together on both sides of the aisle and do the same thing. You know, I think we keep the messaging simple. You know, one of the interesting things that I see happening right now with respect to to Proposition K, which is the effort to audit Austin, is there's this recurring question. You know, what are they hiding? I think that same question could be applied to this particular set of issues. You know, why are we preventing the public from seeing this information? What are they hiding? I think if you keep your messaging simple and do it in recurring fashion, that will help to garner a lot of public interest. I think you keep the legislation simple and direct. You know, let's really put the pressure on those guys to defend what I think is very bad practice. It's going to be difficult in committee for the TMLs and the TACs and the others to argue against transparency. I think we have an opportunity to arm legislators on the dais with some very piercing questions that could potentially be used, right, and sent out social media, and op-eds and whatnot, but to really shine a light on the common sense nature of some of these reforms. So there's a lot of different tactics I think you can employ, but it's going to be hard, unfortunately. And to Luis's point, one of the things that I see happening in the next legislative session is I think a lot of these guys are going to be spread thin, right? There's going to be a lot of really challenging issues ranging from property tax reform to paid sick leave to the continuation of annexation reform to Chapter 312. I mean, you just go on down the line and there is a lot of stuff percolating. And so I don't know that they're going to have the level of resources necessary to put up a robust defense on something that I think we can all agree is common sense. So, you know, at a minimum, maybe that particular aspect is encouraging.
I think we've got time for one more question. Anyone else? Ken.
I'd just like to point out.
Yeah, so Ken's wasn't so much a question as a statement, and it was about the hypocrisy in the fact that that some governmental entities, while denying the access to date of birth information through Public Information Act requests, are also selling that information through their databases. And so you can get the information if you're willing to pay a price, but you can't get it through the Texas Public Information Act, which demonstrates some significant hypocrisy. Now, to Terry's point about getting various elected officials involved that may think differently or have different opinions than the trade organizations, one of them, with regard to date of birth, is the fact that the former City of Austin police chief, now the City of Houston police chief, has said that date of birth information should be public. It makes everybody's job easier in verifying who is out there accused of crimes, committing crimes, et cetera. And so there are some public officials who don't agree with the current state of affairs. And those are people with whom we need to be partnering and helping to inform our lawmakers of their opinions as well. We've got one more question. So the question is dealing with security and safety and access to information online, and I think that's actually slightly different than getting information through a Texas Public Information Act request. When you're getting information through a Texas Public Information Act request, you're requesting specific information, and it's not that you are gaining access to a database that you can hack. So I think those are actually two different things, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it further after the panel. I think our time is up. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being here today.
It was nice to be with you, Linda.